Okay, so you want to own a cinema. You picture it on a Friday night. The marquee glowing out on the street, your name or your theater's name up in those big backlit letters. There's a line at the door. The smell of hot butter hits you the second you walk into the lobby. That smell you can't get anywhere else, and the carpet has that deep, plush, red and gold pattern that says, "This is an event." You walk past the concession stand, and the popcorn is popping in the glass case, and a teenager in a little vest is tearing tickets. Inside the auditorium, the lights go down, the room goes quiet, 400 strangers lean forward at the exact same moment, and the projector throws that beam of light over their heads and onto the screen. And you own that. You own the room where the whole town comes to feel something together. You're the person who brought the movies to Main Street. That's the picture. That's what the movies, and honestly the whole nostalgia of the thing, sell you. The cinema as a temple. The owner as a kind of local hero. Here's the problem. Almost none of the money you're imagining is actually yours. That ticket the kid just tore, roughly half of it, sometimes far more than half, leaves your building before the closing credits even roll, and it goes straight to a movie studio in Los Angeles you will never meet. The projector throwing that gorgeous beam of light cost you as much as a house, and it'll be obsolete before your loan is paid off. The 400 seats. On a normal Tuesday, maybe 30 of them are full, and that beautiful, glowing, packed-out Friday night you're imagining, that happens a handful of weekends a year, entirely at the mercy of whether some director in Hollywood delivered a hit, which is a decision you have zero control over. So let me reframe the whole thing right now, because this is the sentence the entire video hangs on. A cinema is not really a movie business. It's a real estate and snack food business that happens to rent Hollywood's product as bait to get people through the door. Read that again. You are not in the film industry. You are in the popcorn industry, operating out of an extremely expensive building, and the films are just the reason people show up hungry. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly where every dollar of a movie ticket actually goes, why the popcorn costs $11 and why that's not greed but survival, why the single most important number in this business is one that most first-time buyers never even ask about, and how one of the biggest theater chains on the planet, a household name, borrowed its way into an $8.9 billion hole and collapsed into bankruptcy in the span of about 4 years. And by the end, you'll understand the counterintuitive move that lets the smart owners quietly win while the romantics slowly bleed out. Let's get into it. Before we talk about money, we need to talk about what a cinema actually is. Because the cinema is not one business. It's at least 4 businesses wearing the same red carpet. Some are the giant chain multiplexes, your Regals, your AMCs, your Cinemarks, 12, 16, 20 screens attached to a shopping mall or a big box retail strip. These live and die on volume, on parking, and on foot traffic from the stores next door. Some are the single-screen or two-screen independents, the ones you're probably romanticizing, often in an old downtown building, run by a family or a true believer, surviving on charm, community, and a bar that stays open. Some are the art house and repertory houses that skip the blockbusters entirely and program indie films, foreign films, and old classics for a specific, loyal, cinephile crowd. And some are the newer luxury dine-in theaters, leather recliners, a full kitchen, a cocktail menu, a server who brings a burger to your seat, which are honestly closer to being restaurants than they are to being cinemas. For different animals. For completely different balance sheets. For this video, we're going to focus mostly on the small to mid independent, the 3 to 5 screen operator on Main Street, because that's the one real people actually buy, that's the one the fantasy is about, and it's the one where the brutal math is easiest to see clearly. But almost everything we cover scales right up to the giants. In fact, we'll watch it break one of the giants later. Okay, so, the entry cost. The number that gets people's attention. How much does it cost to just get in the door and own one of these? Well, it depends entirely on which of those 4 animals you're buying, and whether you're building new or taking over something that already exists. According to industry cost breakdowns from cinema equipment specialists and construction estimators, a small 1 to 2 screen theater, especially a retrofit where you're reusing an existing building shell, can start somewhere around $250,000 to $500,000. A mid-sized 3 to 5 screen operation typically runs from roughly $950,000 up to about $2.5 million. And a full ground-up multiplex, 6 screens or more. That's $2.5 million to $5 million and up, easily into the 7 and 8 figures once you factor in the land. Now here's the thing you have to burn into your brain, and it's the first real lesson of this entire business. The purchase price and the profitability are two completely different numbers, and they are barely related to each other. You can buy a charming, fully built, turnkey single-screen theater in a small town for less than the price of a modest house. It'll look like a steal, and it can still lose money every single month for the rest of your life, because what you bought wasn't a profit machine. You bought a very large, a very specialized room with a very expensive appetite. The cheap cinema is cheap for a reason. Usually the reason is that the person selling it already ran the math you're about to run. And that brings us to the costs nobody puts on the listing. The nobody budgets for this section. Let's go in order, because the order actually matters. First, the projection and sound. This is the one that shocks people. We're not talking about a fancy home projector. A professional digital cinema projector, the DCI-compliant kind you legally need to screen a new Hollywood release, historically cost anywhere from around $50,000 up to $150,000 per screen. For comparison, the old 35mm film projectors they replaced cost around $30,000, but here's the cruel twist. Those old film projectors lasted 30 years with cheap maintenance. The digital ones? Exhibitors were told to expect maybe 10 years before a full, expensive refresh. And then there's the sound. According to theater owners quoted by IndieWire, a top-of-the-line Dolby Atmos sound system, the immersive kind, speakers all around and above you, can run $75,000 to $100,000 for the equipment and install on a single premium screen. Put it together, and one owner said building a brand new laser projector auditorium from scratch cost about $200,000 per standard screen and up to $375,000 for a premium large format screen, and that's before the seats, before the carpet, before the actual room. Before a single ticket is sold, you are already $250,000 into one room. Second, the seats and the interior. And this isn't vanity, it's competitive survival. Over the last decade, the entire industry converted to those big electric recliners, because once the theater across town has them, a normal seat feels like an insult. Reseating an auditorium with luxury recliners costs tens of thousands per screen, and here's the sting, recliners take up way more space, so you lose anywhere from a third to half your seats in the process. You spend a fortune to sell fewer tickets. We'll come back to why that math can still work. It has to do with popcorn. Third, compliance and the building itself. This is a public assembly space, which means fire suppression systems, sprinklers, emergency exits, and full accessibility compliance under the Americans with Disabilities Act, ramps, accessible seating, assistive listening devices. Then there's the HVAC, the heating and cooling, and this is genuinely one of the largest hidden costs of the whole operation. You are paying to heat and cool enormous, high-ceilinged, mostly empty rooms, all day, whether one person is in there or 100. A cinema is basically a warehouse you have to keep at a perfect 72 degrees. Fourth, the working capital. The money you need just to be open before the business finds its feet. Staff you have to hire and train before you've earned a cent. The first orders of popcorn, cups, soda syrup, and candy. Insurance premiums paid up front. Marketing to tell the town you exist. Most people who buy a cinema underestimate this number by a mile, and it's the one that quietly kills them in the first year, not because the theater failed, but because they ran out of cash before it succeeded. So far, so good. Painful, but survivable. Now here's where it gets interesting, because we've arrived at the single fact that recontextualizes everything. Let's slow all the way down for this one. When someone buys a ticket to a new release, you, the theater owner, do not keep that money. You split it with the movie studio, through something called film rental. And the split is not in your favor, especially at the start. According to the film distribution industry and multiple exhibition sources, theaters pay an average of roughly 50 to 55% of ticket sales back to the studios. But that average hides something worse. The deals run on a sliding scale over the life of a film's run. In the opening week, the storied 90-10 split, the studio can take up to 90% of the box office, leaving the theater with 10%. As the weeks go by, That flips in the theater's favor, maybe 70-30 by week 3, maybe 30-70 by week 15, to reward you for keeping the movie on screen longer. Now put those two facts together. The biggest blockbusters, the ones that fill your seats, the Friday night dream, are exactly the films where the studio takes the largest cut and leaves you almost nothing on the ticket. And the small, older films where you'd keep most of the box office? Nobody's coming to see those. Let that land for a moment. The films that bring the crowds barely make you any money at the box office. So how does a cinema survive at all? It survives on the crowd itself. It survives on what that crowd buys on the walk from a ticket tier to the seat, the popcorn. According to research from the Stanford Graduate School of Business, concessions account for only about 20% of a theater's gross revenue, but around 40% of its profits. Because, as CNBC and industry operators confirm, while ticket money gets split with the studio, 100% of the concession money stays with the theater. And the margins are staggering. The profit margin on concession items runs around 85%, and on a fountain soda it's even higher. The popcorn markup has been estimated at roughly 1,000%. That $11 popcorn costs the theater maybe $1 in corn, oil, salt, and the bag. This is the whole game. This is the aha. The ticket is not the product. The ticket is the cover charge that gives you the right to sell someone a soda. Roger Ebert once ran a reader explanation of this, and industry insiders have a name for the underlying number, the house nut, the theater's operating cost that gets negotiated into these deals. But the punchline is simpler than all the jargon. It is not a film business. It is not even really a ticket business. It is a beverage and snack business with a Hollywood-powered customer acquisition engine bolted to the front. Which is exactly why those recliners make sense even though they cost you half your seats. Fewer, richer seats, filled by people who are comfortable, relaxed, and about to order a second beer. You're not selling seats. You're selling appetite. So let's build the revenue model in layers, now that you know where the real money hides. The first layer is the box office. High volume, low margin, largely controlled by Hollywood, and mostly a mechanism for generating the second layer. The second layer is concessions. Lower volume, absurdly high margin, 100% yours. This is the engine. In fact, the entire chain Marcus Theatres reportedly pulls something like 44% of its total revenue from concessions. The third layer is on-screen advertising, those slides and commercials before the trailers. It's pure profit, sold either directly or through a big cinema advertising middleman, and for a busy theater it's a quiet, steady, meaningful stream that costs you almost nothing to produce. The fourth layer is what you might call the building's other uses. Private screenings, birthday parties, corporate rentals, esports events, screening a big football game or a live opera broadcast, or renting the whole auditorium out on a dead Monday. Every one of those is high margin because the building is already sitting there. The room is a sunk cost. Anything it earns beyond the box office is gravy. And the fifth layer, for the modern operator, is membership and loyalty subscription programs, season passes, gift cards. This is subtle but powerful, because it turns a wildly unpredictable business into something with at least a little recurring, upfront cash. Gift cards in particular are basically an interest-free loan from your customers, some of which never even gets redeemed. That's the income. Now the bleed. The recurring, monthly, whether you like it or not, operating costs. Labor first. A cinema is staff-heavy at exactly the wrong times. You need your most people on nights, weekends, and holidays, and almost none during the day. Box office, concessions, ushers, cleaners, projection, management. It's a lot of part-time, high turnover, minimum and near minimum wage labor, and scheduling it against unpredictable crowds is a genuine art. Then utilities, and remember, you're climate controlling those cavernous rooms all day. Electricity to run the projectors, the sound, the lights, the HVAC, is one of the biggest line items on the page. Then rent or mortgage on a very large footprint in a location that, by definition, needs to be visible and accessible. Then maintenance and repairs. Projector bulbs alone historically cost hundreds to over $1,000 each and burn out on a schedule. Recliners break, screens tear, sound systems fail, and every one of those is an emergency because a dark auditorium earns nothing. Then insurance, liability for a public space full of people in the dark. Then property taxes. Then the endless small stuff, cups, napkins, cleaning supplies, licensing, point-of-sale software, credit card processing fees, and the popcorn and syrup that are, again, the only things really keeping you alive. Now, here's the structural threat that can break the whole model. And it's not streaming, at least not directly. It's something more mechanical than that. Your entire revenue depends on a product you do not make, cannot control, and cannot predict: the release slate. The movies Hollywood decides to make, and when they decide to release them. You can run the most beautiful, best managed, cleanest theater in the state, with the friendliest staff and the crispest projection, and if the studios have a weak summer, or push their big titles to next year, or a labor strike shuts down production so the pipeline runs dry 18 months later, your seats are empty through no fault of your own. Your costs are almost entirely fixed. The building costs the same to run whether the movie is a blockbuster or a bomb. So your profit swings violently on a variable you have no say over. That's not a business risk. That's a dependency. You're a bar that can only serve the one drink your unpredictable supplier feels like shipping this month. And this is the trap that has broken operators far, far bigger than your main street tree screen. Which brings us to the real case study. Let's talk about Cineworld. If you're in the United States, you may not know the name Cineworld, but you absolutely know its American arm, Regal Cinemas, the big chain in malls and shopping centers all across the country. Cineworld was a British company, started decades ago, listed on the London Stock Exchange, a genuine household name in the UK. And in the 2010s, it decided it wanted to be huge. Not big, huge. The rise is a story about ambition and, more precisely, about debt. In 2018, Cineworld swallowed Regal in a deal worth about $3.6 billion, paying $23 a share, in cash, for the entire American chain. Overnight, Cineworld became the second-largest cinema operator on the planet, thousands of screens across the United States, the UK, Central Europe, Israel. On paper, a transatlantic empire, and crucially, it did this the way empires are often built, by borrowing enormous sums of money to fund the acquisition. Then it tried to do it again. In 2019, Cineworld agreed to buy the big Canadian chain, Cineplex, for around $2.8 billion Canadian dollars. More scale, more debt. And then, the timing here is almost cruel. The pandemic hit in 2020. Cineworld walked away from the Cineplex deal, Cineplex sued, and a court later ordered Cineworld to pay very substantial damages for breaking the agreement. So now you've got a mountain of acquisition debt and a giant legal judgment, right as every single one of your theaters is legally forced to close and your revenue drops to essentially zero. And here's where the fixed cost problem we just described becomes fatal at scale. When you own thousands of enormous rooms, the rent, the leases, the interest payments, they don't pause because there's a pandemic. The bleed continues in the dark. Then the recovery came slower than anyone hoped. Some studios sent their films straight to streaming, and the box office didn't bounce back fast enough to service that debt. By the end of 2021, according to reporting from The Hollywood Reporter, Cineworld's net debt stood at roughly $8.9 billion. Read that number again, nearly $9 billion. And on September 7, 2022, Cineworld Group and more than 100 affiliated companies filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in a court in Houston, Texas, nearly $5 billion in debt on the American side alone, more than 9,000 screens caught up in it. The company that had bought its way to number 2 in the world spent the next year in a court-supervised restructuring, wiped out its shareholders. The ordinary people who'd held the stock got essentially nothing, and finally emerged in July 2023 owned by its lenders. The empire didn't die, exactly, but the people who dreamed it up lost everything, and the people it owed money to took the keys. Here's the lesson, and it's the whole reason we told that story. Cineworld wasn't destroyed because people stopped loving movies. Attendance was recovering. It was destroyed because it treated a wildly volatile, fixed-cost, supplier-dependent business as if it were a stable, predictable one you could safely pile billions in debt on top of. The romance of scale met the mechanics of the model, and the mechanics won. Every single time, the mechanics win. So if the model is this brutal, thin box office, punishing fixed costs, a supplier you can't control, and giants going bankrupt, why does anyone smart still own cinemas? Because the sophisticated money isn't really playing the movie game at all. Here's the deeper game. Watch what the savvy owners actually do. First, they lean into the counterintuitive mechanism we uncovered. They treat the whole operation as a food and beverage business, and they push relentlessly into the highest margin version of it. That's why the dine-in theater with the full bar exists. A cocktail has a far better margin than a movie ticket and doesn't get split with anyone in Hollywood. The screen becomes the reason you booked a table. The kitchen and the bar are where you actually make the money. They're running a restaurant that happens to show films. Second, they play the tax game. When you buy that fleet of digital projectors and sound systems and recliners, that's equipment, and equipment gets depreciated. Provisions in the U.S. tax code, like the well-known Section 179 deduction and bonus depreciation, can let a business write off a large chunk of that expensive gear against its income, sometimes in the very first year. So that terrifying $250,000 per screen equipment bill isn't only a cost. For a profitable owner, it's also a shield that legally shelters other income from tax. The romantic sees an expense. The operator sees a deduction. Third, and this is the biggest one, they play the real estate game. Remember how, right at the top, I said this is really a real estate business? A cinema anchors foot traffic. It's the reason a shopping center fills its parking lot on a Friday night, the reason the restaurants and shops around it get customers. That makes cinema real estate strategically valuable, and the smartest players separate the two businesses. They own the building through one entity and operate the theater through another, so that even in a lean year for films, the land underneath is quietly appreciating and can be borrowed against, redeveloped, or sold. And when a location finally doesn't work as a cinema, that big, well-located box can be converted into retail, a gym, a church, a self-storage facility, something else entirely. The operator is exposed to Hollywood's mood swings. The landlord is exposed to the value of American land, which is a very different, and much steadier, bet. That's the reframe within the reframe. The romantics buy the movie business and pray for a good slate. The professionals own the building, run the snack bar, harvest the tax breaks, and treat the films as a traffic driver for all three. Same red carpet. Completely different game. So let's bring it all the way home with the two scenarios, using a realistic single-screen to small multiplex operator on Main Street. These are illustrative numbers, built from the real ranges we've covered, not a specific theater's books, but they're the kind of math a real buyer runs. The good year. A strong release slate, say a year stacked with the kind of blockbusters that turn into cultural events. Your seats fill on the big weekends. Attendance is up, and because attendance is up, so are concessions, which is where you actually live. The advertising money is flowing because advertisers want to be in front of those crowds. You rent the auditorium out for private events on your slow nights. Your fixed costs, the building, the staff, the utilities, are spread across a big pile of admissions, so every extra ticket after you've covered your nut drops mostly to the bottom line. In a year like that, a well-run small operator can do genuinely well, throw off real cash, and make the whole beautiful dream look easy. The marquee glows. The line's out the door. This is the year you tell your friends you have the best job in the world. The bad year. The studios have a weak slate, sequels nobody wanted, big titles pushed to next year, a couple of high-profile flops, or a production slowdown that dried up the pipeline. The crowds don't come. But, and this is the whole point, your costs barely move. The building still needs heating and cooling. The staff still needs paying, or you cut them and the service falls apart. The insurance, the property taxes, the loan payment on those $250,000 projectors, all still due, all on the first of the month, blockbuster or not. Your box office is thin, and thin box office means thin concessions, and thin concessions means the engine that actually funds this whole thing is sputtering. Now you're dipping into that working capital you underestimated, month after month, waiting for a slate you don't control to save you. That's the year the romantics quietly put the place up for sale and discover the next buyer is running exactly the same math they should have run at the start. Same building, same seats, same popcorn machine. The difference between the good year and the bad year is almost entirely a set of decisions made in Los Angeles by people who have never heard your name. That is the business. Not the projector. Not the marquee. The dependency. So here's where we circle back to that Friday night. The glowing marquee, the line at the door, the beam of light over 400 heads, the whole town leaning forward together. That picture is real. It's genuinely one of the last places a community sits shoulder to shoulder in the dark and feels the same thing at the same time, and there's a real dignity in being the person who keeps that room alive. If that's why you want it, go in with your eyes open, own the building if you possibly can, treat the popcorn like the profit center it actually is, and never, ever bet the whole thing on a good slate. Because the light on the screen was never the business. The room the people are sitting in, and everything you sell them on the way to their seats, that's the business. That's the full ready-to-narrate script. It runs roughly 3,600 words, which should comfortably fill a 25 to 35-minute narrated video. It follows your exact stage order: dream, hook, turn, promise, taxonomy, entry, cost, hidden infrastructure, core mechanism, revenue layers, operating costs, risk, Cineworld case study, deeper game, 2 scenario, close. And every figure is drawn from real sources: NATO/Cinema Foundation ticket prices, Stanford GSB and CNBC on concession margins, film distribution, rental splits, IndieWire equipment costs, and the documented Cineworld/Regal Chapter 11 collapse.